How does the Epistle on music fit into the overall framework of the Rasa'il Ikhwan al Safa?
Well, there's a very obvious answer to that, which is that it's one of the 4 or 5 initial Rasa'il, which are the mathematical sciences. So it's preceded by arithmetic and geometry, and the other one would be astronomy, which suggests to the modern reader, I suppose, a very limiting approach, that it's all about number. It's all about string lengths and ratios and rather arcane matters like that. Whereas what you might expect from a chapter on music from another culture is to know what it sounds like. We're saturated with recordings, and if we don't have those, we might expect to see notation. If we don't have that, we might expect to know about whether music was a prestigious career, how musicians were trained, how they were paid, and so on and so forth, and not just to be limited to number. But one of the interesting things about the Risala is the way in which it actually transcends what seems to be a very narrow set of parameters, so that it deals with much more, and therefore it overlaps with other considerations within the encyclopedia as a whole. That is, it inhabits a moral universe, it inhabits a cosmological, ethical, and divine universe. And if you want a summary of what it's essentially about, much the best thing I can do is to read you the summary that was made by one of the transmitters of the text. So it occurs in just one of the manuscripts, and therefore isn't part of the published text, clearly in addition. But it's a beautiful summary of the content, so if I may, I shall just read it to you. So it says that the Risala provides the following: a clarification that notes and rhythmical melodies have effects on the souls of listeners like those of medicines, potions, and antidotes on the physical body, and that the movements of the celestial spheres in their orbits and their friction produce sweet notes and rhythmical melodies like the notes of lute strings and wind instruments. The purpose of all these being to arouse in the angelic human soul a desire to ascend there after that parting from the body we call death. So there is clearly a transcendental message that I think is at the core of what the Rasa'il are essentially about.
What were the particular linguistic challenges associated with the manuscripts that you were working with?
Well, these depend up to a point on the fabric of the manuscript tradition as a whole. But on balance, I would say those are not particularly severe. It's fairly easy to see where you have a group of manuscripts that have either deviated from an archetype that you can spot in certain contexts, and therefore you would discard the variant readings that they give you. So really what we're talking about is the actual lexical challenges that the subject matter itself provides, rather than editorial problems. Of those there are definitely some, and you can approach it in various ways, but since we're agreed that at the moment it isn't possible to derive a perfect stemma for the whole corpus, therefore there isn't one master reading that we can strive to arrive at. It therefore is a choice between various possible readings, and often I think it's reasonable to select from them pragmatically. So that's how this edition comes forward. But the more interesting question perhaps is what are the particularly difficult expressions, difficult words that appear, and how do you deal with those? The answer to that is straightforward, with considerable difficulty, because they are rather difficult. They concern, though, largely specialist terms. If we're thinking about have we got the right Arabic word here, we're talking about one or two technical terms within the realm of music. For example, there are some rather peculiar instrument names that appear. They're not attested elsewhere, and so very much one is in the dark. There are also some terms that are co-opted, shall we say, from other disciplines, and that requires a little bit of ferreting around, but usually you get there. So the textual difficulties on the whole, I would say, are not very great. But to the above, one ought to add that there are a few places where, although the Ikhwan generally write fairly clearly, the syntax in some places gets a little bit knotty. There are some rather lengthy periods that rather lose track of where they're going, and so you have to intervene and try and redirect them.
Do the musical concepts and technical language lend themselves easily to English, or is there much that is specific to the time, culture and language?
Well, there's certainly a reasonable amount that's problematic. We all know the Italian tag that translators are traitors, so there are problems throughout. But if you're talking specifically about musical vocabulary, I've already alluded to instrument names, so that's definitely one area. So it's not just the case that there are a few names that we don't find elsewhere, and therefore you can only see them in this particular context. It's also the case that there are a number of instrument names that do occur elsewhere, but that are never defined, or never adequately defined. So we're not quite sure exactly what we're talking about. For example, if you look at wind instruments, there are a number of words that now we know very clearly denote instruments that have reeds, as against flutes that don't. But it's not at all clear at this period whether that's also the case. And so translation sometimes has to be a bit approximate. Similarly, there are one or two instrument names that are evidently derived from, but are probably misunderstandings of classical Greek, filtered through some odd sideways glance at Byzantine practice of not so long ago. And so, for example, a word that almost certainly referred originally to the hydraulis, a water-driven organ, is defined somewhere around this period as a stringed instrument. But it's also an instrument used in battle, so there's something very wrong going on here. And exactly what the Ikhwan are talking about is not always clear. Elsewhere, the problems are more of semantic mapping, again, the perennial problem that words never match exactly from one language to another. I mean, the very word music itself translates what, and vice versa, or put it the other way around. The basic word musiqi in the text, we translate as music, we have to. But its resonance is a little bit different. It incorporates, shall we say, part of what we would call music theory. So that's just one example. And there's a much more strident one, if you like. There's a word which we normally translate now, and is currently certainly understood in modern Arabic as meaning melody. But it's very clear that in part of the Risala, it means very specifically rhythm. It means the rhythmic structures. Now, when we think about it, we realize that the division between melody and rhythm is artificial. You can't have a melody without time. It exists in time. The notes have to be given particular durations. They have rhythmic values. These come together in this particular word, but you have to sometimes opt for one or the other when translating, which is extremely irksome.
What do the Ikhwan consider to be the psychological applications of music?
What is a psychological application of music? Do we mean, can music affect one's mood? The answer to that, most certainly yes. And the Ikhwan do discuss this, not at length. They're fitting here into a general paradigm. The perception of music was that it was mood-inducing, shall we say. So there's a standard pattern of instructions for musicians that the Ikhwan also use, such that at the beginning of an assembly, a musician ought to be singing, playing fairly slow, dignified pieces that are associated with serious moods and emotions and a rather high ethical content, possibly also notions of valor, bravery, and so forth. as the evening event progresses, they can become increasingly jolly and move to lighter rhythms and create a more festive mood. But at the end, when the assembly, not being particularly pious, it is assumed, has become rather inebriated and can become rowdy, they then have to retune, select a particularly sober kind of song and calm everybody down. So there's definitely the notion that music affects mood. But if you go beyond what we will call narrow psychology, it also, if you like, affects physiology. It has physical effects on the body. And this will be expressed in a theory about the medical therapeutic effects of music. So the cosmological link here, if you like, is through the concept of the humours and the theory that for a healthy person these need to be in balance. Sickness is an indication of imbalance, and therefore the cunning doctor will select an appropriate musical element that will help address this problem and redress the balance.
In what way do the Ikhwan relate music to spirituality?
They actually do it in two ways, I would say. The first one is, in a very abstract way, it is through number. So we're coming back to the original notion of the link with mathematics. And this is to do with the simple notion of the primacy of harmonious relations between simple numbers. So, for example, in music, if you divide a string in two and sound half of it, you've got a 2-to-1 ratio, which gives you the interval of the octave. So you've got a straightforward set of correlations between numerical ratios and things that most of us find pleasing as sound. And so the transference is that that occurs in the cosmos. The spheres, as they rotate, the heavenly bodies within the spheres, produce sounds, and these are matching. So the heavenly bodies stand between each other in harmonious proportion. And at a certain point, the Ikhwan actually gives us a table of distances from the Earth to the Moon to the various planets, Sun, and so on and so forth. And all of the ones that are calculated as simple ratios, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-3, etc., these are considered harmonious, whereas there are one or two planets, Saturn and Mars, I think, among them, where the ratio is not so simple, and they are discarded from the scheme. They are considered planets of ill omen, precisely because of this factor. So you have this very straightforward projection derived from Pythagoras, largely, about the importance of number, and also that the primary numbers are those from which everything else can be derived through various computational procedures. The other route is related to the first one. If you like, it is the position of the human soul in relation to the cosmos. So it needs to ascend through, they don't mention a number of stages, but anyway, the soul within the living body aspires to the status of the soul within the divine realm, the realm that we can attain after death. And this is very much planned against the cosmological, physical scheme of the cosmos, if you like. And it's almost as if the Ikhwan are trying to find a particular celestial sphere in which you actually belong at a certain point. So that, of course, requires that there is an ethical scheme which allows one to be justifiably transported from this lower realm of decay and corruption to the imperishable realm. And so good behaviour is involved, and this is brought about by us following the injunctions of the prophets and the sages. And what's very interesting here is that the Ikhwan speak very little in explicitly Islamic terms, whatever their doctrinal persuasion may or have been. They speak of the prophets, but they also speak of the sages, as if these are parallel and mutually reinforcing sources of authority. The prophets obviously give God's revealed word to man. The sages somehow have access to knowledge which allows them to produce injunctions and exhortations that actually match precisely those of the prophets. So clearly there is a moral universe which we should inhabit. And that conspires with the other musical numerical domain to achieve this state.
It has been said that the Ikhwan are not very conceptually innovative, drawing extensively on ancient and contemporary sources. What are the features of this text that make it unique?
It's a rather eclectic text, which is a partial response to your remarks about lack of innovation or inventiveness. But it is quite unique in the way that it draws various strands together. Some of these strands we can see in earlier work. It's very clear, for example, that they're quite indebted to Al-Kindi. And it's with Al-Kindi, if you like, the first generation of philosopher scholars whose work survives, who are ingesting and trying to come to grips with the Greek legacy, in some cases extending beyond it. And both what you might call the scientific, mathematical, counting ratio side of things and the cosmological and the therapeutic, all these things are present in Al-Kindi. So he will talk about Greek concepts of scale, he will talk about the relationships between the strings of the lute and the humours, the elements, colours, perfumes, whatever you like, a whole cosmological series of associations. He will talk about the way different cultures prefer different numbers for the strings of their instruments. So Christians obviously have three-stringed instruments because they have the Trinity, etc., etc. And he also discusses the structure of rhythmic cycles. This is a more directly musicological question, not connected with cosmology, or not obviously so, in some detail. So he covers this range, and nearly all of this comes through in the Ikhwan. And it's very clear, for example, that their scheme of what you might call the fourfold things, precisely these relationships of the seasons and the humours and the temperaments and rhythms and strings of the lute, it's not the same as Kindi, but it's absolutely the same species. It's a manipulation of this material. And they're more directly indebted to Al-Kindi for their treatment of rhythm, which is one of the more complex parts of the Risala. And one of the most interesting from a purely musicological perspective, because it actually tells us a lot about how the area was conceptualized and indeed how actually certain patterns could be developed and changed. So we have that broad range of Greek-derived materials that are quite strictly musicological, if you wish, would generally be understood as such. But, as we've discussed, they incorporate this into a much wider sort of ethical and cosmological treatment. And that is what makes this treatise unique. Also, in that you could say it's both the first of its kind and the last of its kind, precisely because later the tradition splits and we no longer have this cohesive overview where everything belongs together.
How do you view the Rasa'il's contribution more broadly to the arts and sciences?
You can certainly regard the Ikhwan reasonably, if also unfairly, as producing a literary text. It can be read for enjoyment. There are actually one or two funny passages in it which are meant to be amusing. There are places where they adopt a fairly rhetorical and highly wrought style, which is very effective, quite impressive as writing, even though much of the writing is just factual and plain. So it fits into a broad concept of literature which goes far beyond our narrower notions of novel, poem, play. Beyond that, it's difficult to think of it as fitting into the world of the arts. What you've got, I think, is an interesting reversal, of which this is just one example, and that is in other arts, particularly the visual arts and architecture, we have this odd situation of an abundance of surviving material to study, although the specialists in the field, of course, can never have enough. Whereas in music, you have nothing. We have no music that survives. And yet, we've got a fairly abundant literature talking about music, and we don't have any literature talking about the other arts. So there's no way, really, of teasing out from within the culture, I think it's very, very difficult to do, what aesthetic canons were, what perceptions were. It's all done after the letter, and often by importing ideas from other cultures of possibly dubious value. So here we do actually have that wider domain. And one can, up to a point, tease out one or two aesthetic principles from the Ikhwan with regard to music. So that's an area in which it conceivably could shed some light on other arts. With regard to science, was that the other part of the question? Again, what do we mean by science? I suppose the narrow answer would be the theory of music understood as a scientific factual inquiry, telling us precisely what the size of a flute was, or exactly how high-pitched a note was and how it combined with others. And the answer here, I think, has to be straightforwardly that the Ikhwan don't take us further than other writers of the period, except possibly, as I mentioned before, in the realm of rhythm, where they've got certain things to say which do build on what Al-Kindi had said and give us some insight into phenomena, although they do not go as far as Al-Farabi does. So if you really want to know how complicated things can get, and we presume did get, it is actually to Al-Farabi that you would turn in the first instance. So it really is the comprehensive nature of the Risala, I think, that it is its great attraction, rather than any one specific point within it.